The rain had been falling since before dawn, soaking the narrow back roads of the valley until the dirt shoulders collapsed in places and the ditches ran deep with brown, fast-moving water, the kind that carried sticks and leaves in restless spirals. On a stretch just beyond the last row of old farmhouses, Mara caught sight of something pressed against the far side of the road, low to the ground, almost lost in the blur of rain. And at first her mind placed it as debris. Maybe a branch snapped from one of the pines lining the fence, maybe a trash bag washed from someone's yard. But then, as her truck drew level, it shifted, not with the roll of water but with the hesitant, deliberate movement of a living thing, lifting a head so heavy with rain that the ears drooped to either side. She braked gently, heart picking up in that quiet way that comes when the mind knows something is wrong before words form. And when she stepped out, the cold met her with a sharp, wet slap to the skin, the air smelling of earth turned raw by weather. Her boots found the softened gravel, and she walked toward it, seeing now that it was a small dog, standing only because the bank behind it was too steep to sit against without slipping into the ditch, its fur plastered tight against a thin frame, the pale strands along its chest tangled with grit and clumped from the weight of water. Its eyes half closed against the downpour, blinking with slow, uneven movements as though the act itself took more effort than it should, the body trembling, not in sudden shivers but in a steady, draining shake that seemed to start from the spine and ripple through its ribs and limbs. She crouched several paces away, bringing herself lower than the dog's head so as not to tower over it, the runoff whispering and splashing against the rocks below. The hiss of rain filling every space between her words when she spoke softly, almost to herself. "It's okay, boy." The syllables carrying no demand, just a tone meant to settle the air between them. He flicked his eyes toward her, then back to the ditch as if keeping track of both dangers at once, his paws near enough to the water that the muddy current touched them in short bursts whenever the wind pushed it higher, and Mara saw how close he was to losing balance. Just a wrong step. Just one moment of weakness and he would slide in, the water pulling him toward the black mouth of the culvert under the road, and in the state he was in there would be no climbing back, no swimming against it, only the silent pull into dark. She let her steps shorten, her movements deliberate and slow, her own breath fogging faintly in the cold, the smell of wet fur reaching her now, sharp and animal mixed with the deeper scent of rotting leaves in the ditch. Her knees finding the mud as she edged nearer until she could see the rise and fall of his ribs under that plastered coat. Too sharp, too visible, each breath fast and shallow as if every inhale needed deciding. Her hand extended slowly, palm open, fingers curled loosely in the rain, offering not to grab but simply to be there. And for a long moment there was no change, only the steady tremor of his frame and the thin stream of water running from the tip of his nose. But then, almost imperceptibly, his weight shifted, his forepaws inching toward her side of the ditch, the muscles in his shoulders working with a carefulness that spoke of fatigue, not fear. Mara reached forward, sliding one hand under his chest where the fur gave way to the narrow, cold hardness of bone, the chill of his body startling even through her own wet skin, her other arm wrapping behind his hind legs to take the weight evenly. And as she lifted, she realized how light he was, lighter than a dog his size should be, a wrongness that settled heavy in her stomach. Yet he made no sound, offered no struggle, only let his head hang low so that rainwater ran from the tips of his ears and down onto her jacket. Back on the road, she adjusted her grip, keeping him close against her, feeling the tremors still running through him, the faint, rapid thud of his heart against her forearm, the fabric of her jacket soaking through quickly under his weight. She glanced toward the ditch, the water still swirling where he had stood, and thought plainly, without flourish, if he runs, he dies, knowing that in weather like this and in his condition, shelter wasn't just preferable. It was the line between hours and minutes. Her truck door stood open, rain spotting the seat, and she eased him down onto the passenger side, not unwrapping the jacket from around him, letting the folds of fabric catch some of the water still streaming from his coat. For the first time since she'd lifted him, he moved of his own accord. Not much, just shifting his head into the curve of the fabric, his eyes slipping closed not with ease but with a surrender born of exhaustion. Mara closed the door softly, the sound of rain suddenly muted to a distant drumming on metal, and walked around to the driver's side, her own clothes hanging heavy with water, her hands cold from the steady contact with his soaked body. The engine started with a low hum, and as the truck rolled forward, the shape beside her remained still save for the faint rise and fall of breath, his ribs moving under the fabric in that same uneven rhythm, the road stretching ahead in a long wet ribbon, the ditch already fading into the blur of rain behind them, and, though nothing was yet certain, not where he had come from, not what the next hours would bring, one fact held with quiet clarity. For now, at least, he was out of the water, and that was enough. ChatGPT said, Mara could feel the dog's frailty before she even truly looked at him. The way his body seemed to fold into her arms as if the effort of standing had already drained everything he had left. And the moment his small weight settled against her chest, she understood in a physical, undeniable way just how close he was to failing. His ribs were a sharp and unforgiving outline beneath the soaked fur, each bone distinct under her hand, as if the skin had been stretched too thin to hide anything. The cold had made his frame rigid in places, yet he felt almost weightless, and that lightness carried its own kind of alarm. A body should not feel so insubstantial. The rain still fell hard, running over both of them in unbroken sheets, and though her jacket was pulled around him, its fabric quickly grew heavy with water, clinging tightly to his shivering body and wicking away the little heat he still had. She adjusted her grip so his head was sheltered beneath the collar, but she could still feel the trembling ripple through him in uneven waves, as if his body could not decide whether to fight the cold or give in to it. She began walking toward the truck, moving slowly over the muddy verge, each step placed carefully so she wouldn't stumble. Because the ditch that paralleled the road was deep and running fast with rainwater, and in that quick, steady current she could see how easily he might have been swept further down, lost from view entirely. The air was sharp with the smell of wet soil and roadside grass, and the wind made her lean her shoulder forward slightly to shield him from its bite. Through the rain, the truck was only a dim shape at first, its edges softened by the weather, but she kept her eyes on it, every step bringing them closer to that small promise of shelter. The dog's breathing was shallow, his chest lifting just enough to prove he was still with her, and the uneven rhythm made her aware of how fine the line was between his current state and the point where he might simply not continue. Once, when her foot sank deeper into a patch of softened ground, she shifted her arms quickly to keep him balanced, and in that moment he gave a small twitch, a brief reflex that seemed as much from instinct as from will, before going still again. His fur smelled faintly of stagnant water beneath the sharpness of the rain, a scent that hinted he had been near or in the ditch for longer than just the moments before she saw him, and there was grit at the edge of his paws, small flecks of mud that clung even through the wash of water running down. She thought about the stretch of road behind them, how cars had passed without slowing, and how easily the gray-brown of his body could vanish against the wet gravel and grass, unseen until it was too late. By the time she reached the truck, her own jacket clung heavily to her shoulders, its weight pressing down with each step, but she did not loosen it. Instead, she opened the passenger door with one hand, careful not to jar him, and slid him inside onto the seat, the fabric beneath instantly darkening as the rainwater spread. She kept the jacket wrapped around him even there, her palm resting against his side, feeling for the faint beat of his heart through the sodden layers. It was there, quick, fluttering, and a little too fast, a pace that spoke of both cold and exhaustion, a body working harder than it should just to hold on. The smell inside the cab changed quickly, the wet fur warming slightly and mixing with the scent of damp fabric, a reminder of the storm outside and the place they had just left. She shut the door with slow care, the muffled sound leaving them in a quieter space and for the first time since she had lifted him from the ground, he let his head rest fully against the fold of her jacket, his body still trembling but no longer bracing against her touch. In that moment, she knew that while this was far from the end of his struggle, the most immediate danger, the rushing water, the cold wind, the endless rain, had been left behind. For now, he was no longer alone by the roadside, no longer a small, soaked shape waiting for the next passing car or the next drop in body temperature to finish what the storm had started. For now, there was a barrier between him and the elements, and it was enough to buy him the time he so clearly needed, enough to make each breath a little less costly than the last. ChatGPT said, "The road unspooled in a muted ribbon beneath the truck's tires, each rotation carrying them farther from the ditch where she had found him." Yet the feeling of urgency did not fade with distance. The rain, steady but no longer pounding, slid in winding paths down the windshield, breaking apart and rejoining in a constant, shifting network of rivulets. Every pass of the wipers cleared the view for only a heartbeat before the world blurred again, shapes of distant trees and the pale curve of the road dissolving into gray. Inside the cab, the air was warmer than the storm outside, though not by much, and it seemed to press close. Holding the scent of damp wool from her jacket and the unmistakable musk of wet dog fur, an odor that spoke not of comfort, but of survival. On the seat beside her, the small dog lay curled tightly, the soaked fabric wrapped around him as much to hold in what heat he had left as to shield him from the drafts that slipped in each time the truck shifted against the wind. His ribs pressed sharp against the material when he breathed, each shallow rise and fall barely moving the layers, and though his eyes remained closed most of the time, there was no ease in his posture, only the kind of stillness that comes when energy is too precious to spend. Occasionally, at a heavier patter of rain on the roof or the sudden splash from a roadside puddle, his head would lift an inch, ears turning faintly toward the sound, and for a moment his body would tense as if bracing for something. Then, when no harm followed, the tension would ebb, and he would sink again into the jacket's folds, his weight almost imperceptible against the seat. Mara kept her hands steady on the wheel, her gaze anchored to the glistening road ahead, but her awareness of him was constant, an unbroken thread of attention that tugged her eyes toward him in every quiet moment between glances at the trafficless stretch before them. She could see the tremors that still ran through him, subtle but unrelenting, each one a reminder that his body was working against the cold still lodged deep in his muscles. She thought about how far the warmth of the truck's cabin could reach, about the blankets she had waiting at home, the dry corner near the stove, and the shallow bowl of water he might be strong enough to drink from. Yet the image came with its own shadow, the understanding that until they arrived, the distance was more than just miles. It was the uncertain space between his current fragility and the safety she hoped to offer. The rhythm of the tires over wet asphalt formed a low hum beneath the rain's lighter percussion, and between the two sounds, the world outside seemed distant, its edges softened. In that quiet, she allowed her fingers to rest on the seam of the seat near his side, not to move him or disturb the careful way he was folded, but to feel the faint trace of heat his body still gave off, proof that he was not slipping further toward the danger she feared. He stirred slightly at one point. A faint shift of weight that pressed his shoulder into the cushion and released a weak sigh, the kind of sound that was neither comfort nor pain, but the release of breath that had been held too long. She did not speak often, but once, when the road curved and they passed beneath a cluster of trees that shielded them from the rain's heavier fall, she murmured, "Almost there," the word soft enough to be absorbed by the hum of the cab, more to mark the passage of the moment than to expect any recognition from him. The miles unfolded with a steady sameness, the rain tapering and strengthening in turns, the light outside shifting between muted gray and the briefest hints of pale brightness breaking through the clouds. Each time the sky lightened, the wet road reflected it in a faint silver sheen, and Mara used those moments to reassure herself that visibility was improving and that conditions were favoring them.